The title of my talk, looking at the youth of this audience, I'm going to have to explain, is Jerry Miller, Eat Your Heart Out. Now, for those of you who probably have never heard of Jerome Miller, he was the guy who in 1970 was brought in by Francis Sargent in Massachusetts, and within the space of about a year, closed every training school in the state of Massachusetts, kicking off a revolution in juvenile corrections that swept the country for many years until we ran up against John DiIulio and his super predator myth, which really brought to a dead stop what was a vibrant juvenile correctional reform movement, initially supported by Ed McConnell Clark Foundation, but rolling around the country. So if this was America in the late 80s, early 90s, we were looking at states closing training schools, reducing the number of youth in custody, transferring youth into basically community-based alternatives, small, close-to-home programs. Again, this ran out of gas in the middle 90s. We had a reversal, but interestingly, that reversal is now yet reversing it again, not necessarily because of Jerry Miller's, but for other reasons. Jerry Miller, so the message for a lot of us, you know, the sort of Mike and my generation, the Miller reforms were the most remarkable and dramatic reforms we had ever seen. Nowadays, you know, we don't think about this, but the most important thing is, at its heyday, Miller probably took about 800 youth out of Massachusetts training schools and moved them to community-based programs. 800. I'm now about to describe to you a reform in California which dropped the population from almost 10,000 down to today's population of a little over 1,600. So we're talking about a reform that's, you know, something in the vicinity of 10 times what Jerry Miller accomplished. And so I want to do is talk a little bit about how that happened, because this is, I think, one of the least known and best and least understood stories in the whole field of juvenile justice. I've got a pending proposal in front of a foundation that hopefully will pay me to write this, but it really has not been well documented. Most people, even in California, don't fully grasp what's going on. And around the country, I think most people's perception is, oh, California, that awful place. And in some areas, that's true. And I want to start with a context. Because again, remember, I'm suggesting that in the last 10 years, California has dropped its youth prison population by 80%. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, the state announced the closure of the Heman G. Stark facility, which was the largest youth training school in America, and by all accounts, the worst. The closure of Stark, which is now going forward to the end of the year, will mean that since 2004, California has closed 6 of the largest youth correctional facilities in the country, 6 of them. In addition to that, 5 what they call conservation camps. The total bed capacity in excess of 4,000 beds been closed just since 2004. So I mean, I would say for all of you, this is a hell of a story that we need to understand and we need to get out to people. Now, I want to pose that in contrast to what's been going on more generally in California. So first of all, and this is data which the latest available data goes to 2006, but you can see that crime rates were plummeting in California, and they've remained down pretty low during this period of time. And again, the big decline was youth authority population was about 10,000 here, down there. Oops, back. I don't know how to work this thing. So that's the overall crime index. Arrest rates been increasing in recent years, but still below what they were. But again, arrests going up, not necessarily reflected in people ending up in correctional facilities. Parolees, that's, you know, another story that Mike can talk about. Lots of parolees in California. The prison population in California has grown substantially. This number's come down a little bit, but we've still got about 170,000 prison inmates in California, about triple New York State. Federal court now mandating that we release 44,000 inmates under the Prison Litigation Reform Act. That's going to go to the Supreme Court this year. So our correctional system is a nightmare and in deep crisis. At about 200% of capacity, as you can see, California did add some beds during this period of time, but basically the California prison population during this same period has just gone up like a rock. And by the way, the only declines recently in the California prison population have essentially, because we've been shipping California prisoners to private prisons or out of state. No real reforms yet, although the legislature has just passed a package of reforms that would bring down these numbers modestly, maybe. And here again, you can see that as prison capacity has increased in California, population has grown even quicker, and again, gross overcrowding. And you can see how it's been worsening over time. And the other issue is we're spending buckets of money on this. This says $7.4 billion. That's just for prison expenditures alone. It's higher than that if you add in the juvenile system and the parole system. Correction spending in California represents 10% of the general fund. And again, in California's financial crisis, correction spending looms large. So that's the bad news in terms of our prison system. So at the same time that's going on, these dramatic juvenile reforms are going on. Now, before I talk into how did this happen, I want to talk about all the myths or the rumors as to all the bad things that occurred. Bad thing number one, well, we took these kids out of youth facilities and they ended up in the prison system. Not true. There's been a very small increase in youth entering California prisons. Last time I looked, there were about 250 juveniles in adult prisons in California. Again, the numbers are starting to track up, even though California has the stiffest direct file laws in the country, still not being used very much. Theory number two, we're sending them out of state. No evidence of that. Pretty good state regulation of out-of-state placements through our child welfare agency. Numbers don't seem to be going anyplace. They are languishing in county facilities. Doesn't appear to be true. In fact, the population of county facilities has actually dropped by about 40% during the same period of time. So they're not, so the push to out of the state has not resulted in an overloading of either county detention centers. You know, the rumor is kids are languishing in detention centers, kids are languishing in county camps and ranches. No evidence to that effect. So again, none of the adverse effects you would imagine seeming to show up. And juvenile crime down generally. Now, I used adult crime figures because in California, the age of jurisdiction goes up to age 25. Most people who are getting released or not being sent to the California Youth Authority are quickly adults. So really, if you want to count a crime impact, you really got to look at adult crime, not juvenile crime for our youth system. But again, juvenile arrests generally pretty low. Juvenile crime rates, you know, been heading downward. No apparent effect in California of chaos in the streets any particular place. I mean, in many places, there are California places that aren't quite as dramatic as New York, but are close to New York in terms of dramatic declines in crime. San Francisco experienced a significant decline in crime. Los Angeles is at 1950 levels of crime. And I always say Bill Bratton must be a miracle worker because not only was crime down in Los Angeles, but in the entire region of Southern California. So he managed to somehow impact Orange County, Riverside, and only Bakersfield, for some reason, escaped Bratton's miracle. But anyway, that's another story.